Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. We're going to go ahead and take some time to look through some bios of our speakers and our panel that we have here today. And so we're going to just take a few minutes to allow everyone to funnel into our panel discussion today. So thank you again for being here, and we'll get started shortly. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for this very timely and important discussion. I wanted to just make sure that everyone knows we are going to get started here in about a minute. What you are seeing right now are the bios of all of our presenters today who will be discussing really how we start rebuilding our refugee resettlement program here in the United States and more locally throughout Colorado and in Denver. So welcome. And since my picture's up, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ateem Ot, and on behalf of the Colorado Refugee Connect, as well as the Denver Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, we want to welcome all of you and thank you for your time as we discuss rebuilding the refugee program, efforts from global to local. So as I said, my name is Ateem, and my office is part of the Human Rights and Community Partnership Agency with the City and County of Denver, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. A little bit about our office is that we work to promote the well-being of immigrant and refugee communities and advocates for inclusive and meaningful integration in Denver. Our partner for this conversation, the Colorado Refugee Connect, is a collaborative initiative designed to further integrate across our state. Their main strategies are learn, engage, and celebrate. And today's webinar will support your learning about more learning, about the resettlement program and hopefully strengthen your engagement. We'll share more about how you can stay connected to Colorado Refugee Connect at the end of our program. So why are we all here? Yes, we know that World Refugee Day is on Sunday. We are celebrating Immigrant Heritage Month, but today's discussion will explore the state of the U.S. refugee program at various levels, starting with an orientation of resettlement in the context of global migration. Then we'll have an overview of how and why refugees are able to come to the United States, and hopefully work our way down to our state refugee agency and local resettlement agencies who receive and support refugees and other immigrant groups throughout Colorado. The landscape of refugee resettlement has experienced a drastic decline over the last 4 years, and it's included an almost complete halt of refugee admissions that has closed many resettlement agencies and left others severely constrained to support entire agencies that depend on the admission of refugees to sustain their programming. With the current administration's directives to restart this massive engine, we hope today's conversation is informative for those new to refugee resettlement about anticipated growth of the program and existing and needed programmatic infrastructure and investment. But again, we also hope to engage those involved across the entire resettlement ecosystem, particularly here in Colorado and Denver, where our resettlement agencies are located, in rethinking and reimagining programmatic and policy innovations, collaborative efforts and opportunities with coordination and community support to serve the needs of refugees, given the challenges faced for the last several years, but also that will continue to be faced due to the current pandemic. So just a couple of housekeeping things that we want to make sure that we're mindful of. If you have questions, please put them into the chat. And we have two individuals who will do their best to respond to those questions either through the chat, or I will also be posing some questions to our panelists as well. And then we will, at the end, have a bit of a question and answer session. So hopefully we'll be able to get to your questions. So please feel free to ask them. If you have any technology needs, you can chat with Mary Francis. And I do just want to give a special thank you to Meg, Sigaria Barrett, Mary Francis Feeney, and Matthew Mahone, who are behind the scenes, so you can't see them, but they've been putting all of this together. And so we really want to be grateful and thankful to their work in putting our panel together. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to our panelists. First, we have Krish Omara Vignaraja. She's the CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Noyes Combs, who is the State Refugee Coordinator for the Colorado Refugee Services Program, or many of us know it as CRISP. Mark Greenberg, who's the Senior Fellow and Director, Human Service Initiative at the Migration Policy Institute. And then we have Ron Buzzard, the Managing Director at ECDC African Community Center. So I think to begin our conversation, as we talked about, we really want to understand what refugee resettlement looks like from the global perspective. Mark, would you like to kick us off and frame our understanding of the refugee resettlement program?
Sure, happy to. Thanks very much, team, and hi, everybody. I really appreciate having the opportunity to participate in today's event. To give some pretty broad framing, first, as I suspect everybody appreciates, each year millions of people migrate around the world. The UN estimates that there were 272 million migrants in 2019, representing about 3.5% of the world's population. And people migrate for many reasons: for economic opportunity, to reunite with family members, to start over in a new home, to escape from violence, corruption, persecution, or poverty. And often these reasons intersect, with people simultaneously fleeing from violence and seeking to reunite with family members and hoping for better economic opportunities after resettling in a new home. Most migration to the United States comes in the form of economic and family-based migration. Each year, about 1 million people attain lawful permanent resident status in the US, little over 13,000 in Colorado in 2019. Most of those attaining LPR status do so as immediate relatives of US citizens or through family-sponsored preferences, and then through employment-based admissions. And even in times of higher refugee admissions, refugees aren't in numbers a large part of those legally admitted to the United States, but the refugee program plays an extraordinarily important role both in helping those who the US admits and in the crucial role that the US plays both domestically and around the world in advancing humanitarian values. Since President Carter signed the Refugee Act of 1980, the US has welcomed more than 3 million refugees from over 80 countries. This has reflected a broad bipartisan commitment to the importance of refugee resettlement across administrations of both parties until the last 4 years. Refugee resettlement has often played a key role in advancing nations' foreign policy goals, such as during the Cold War and in receiving refugees from Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. But often refugee resettlement simply reflects the nation's commitment to helping those who are escaping from genocide and violence and torture and other horrific circumstances. The number of refugees has fluctuated over time. It was actually highest in the early 1980s, a low immediately after 9/11, gradually climbing again, and then reaching the lowest point in the history of the refugee program in the last year of President Trump's administration. President Biden's commitment to restore and strengthen the program provides the crucial context for our discussion today. Countries of origin for refugees change over time, both with changed international conditions and based on decisions by individual presidential administrations. Over the last 10 years, about 60% of admitted refugees were from Myanmar, Iraq, Bhutan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Of the much smaller number admitted in 2020, the majority were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, and Ukraine. These were also the top 3 countries for admissions for Colorado. In 2017, the incoming Trump administration initially stopped and then added heightened vetting for refugees from 11 countries. The share of admissions from those countries fell from 43% in 2017 to 3% the next year. While these were not solely Muslim majority countries, the drops in admission from those countries was the single biggest factor contributing to the sharp drop in Muslim admissions during the Trump administration. About half of refugee admissions are for children or young people under age 20. About 11% are for children under age 5. Refugee resettlement sometimes focuses on immediate employment for adults, but in recent years, a number of states, including Colorado, have placed increased attention on the need for whole family, 2-generation strategies in refugee resettlement. Even with a significant increase in admissions, the number of refugees the US will take in the coming years will represent likely a fraction of those in need. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has estimated that across the world, 82 million people had been forcibly displaced by the end of 2020 due to persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or events seriously disturbing public order. Most were internally displaced persons. 26 million met the formal designation of refugees. Over 1.4 million had been determined in need of durable resettlement beyond their countries of first asylum. While numbers like this can sometimes seem overwhelming, they underscore the critical role that the US plays in leading and demonstrating to other nations the virtues of being welcoming to refugees. Before closing, I want to note the importance of addressing the needs of additional humanitarian populations, including asylees and persons with special immigrant visas. Like refugees, asylees have fled from their country of origin because of persecution or fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. But the key difference is that refugee status is determined overseas and persons then admitted through the refugee program, whereas asylum seekers arrive as unauthorized, undocumented persons and then make their claim for asylum to the federal government. Just as the prior administration curtailed refugee resettlement, it undertook multiple steps to make it harder to prevail on asylum claims and even to be admitted to the country to make a claim. Notwithstanding, there were 46,000 asylum grants in 2019, actually greater than the number of refugee admissions. And due to federal backlogs, there are hundreds of thousands of persons with pending asylum claims in the administration, in the immigration courts or the agency that processes those claims. And finally, the special immigrant visa program is likely to be in the news a lot in the coming months. The program allows admissions of Iraqis and Afghanis who worked as translators or interpreters or who otherwise assisted the US in their countries and are now endangered due to that assistance. The number of SIVs also fell during the Trump administration, but not as sharply as refugee admissions. By 2020, there were nearly as many SIV admissions as refugees. There have been significant problems with delays and backlogs in the program, which the Biden administration is committed to addressing. And as the US winds down its involvement in Afghanistan, there will very likely be heightened attention to efforts to help those who help the United States and who are now at risk. So I hope this background is helpful. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Such a wealth of information. I did want to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about the UN process to, I guess, how countries determine, or what does that kind of behind the scenes picture look like when countries select refugees to be resettled in their respective country?
Sure. So it's different for different countries. And it has varied for the US over time. And one of the most important ways in which it has varied for the US is that prior to the last several years, the United States made use of regional allocations where, and I think Krish is going to get into some of this, but where there is a refugee ceiling established each year, and then with the ceiling, the administration specifies the numbers from individual regions of the world, and then essentially goes through a negotiation process between those who are in need and those who the US has determined to admit. That changed significantly during the Trump administration. They moved away from that. They placed a stronger emphasis, particularly towards the end, on victims or identified victims of religious persecution. That's actually one of the reasons why Ukraine comes to play such a prominent role towards the end of the administration. But happy to say more about that, and I suspect Krish will also.
Yeah, and I think it looks like Krish might have dropped off, and we'll wait for her to rejoin us. Can you speak a little bit, Mark, and for others who might have an insight, what does foreign policy, like what are the US's foreign policy considerations in determining, who we would like or who we are willing to accept as refugees in the US?
Yeah, so that's also something that varies some over time, as I mentioned in my comments. During the Cold War, foreign policy considerations played a very big role, and admissions of persons from communist nations were a significant part of it. I would say, and some of this is frankly done at the State Department and in the White House, and I don't know all the considerations involved. But there is simultaneously an interest in advancing the U.S.'s foreign policy goals and also advancing its humanitarian goals. And when one looks at the lists of countries over time, it is very frequently, and I would say particularly in recent years, it's sometimes less clear that this is a specific foreign policy goal and rather more about responding to urgent need. Yeah, and I should also say, and again, as I alluded to it, many things were different in the last administration, and most clearly the changed priorities that were reflected in that time. And when we look at the drops in admission, there were both drops overall, but notably drops from Europe were not as large as drops from other regions of the world.
Does anyone else have any comments? Thank you, Mark, for that.
While we're waiting for Chris to return, I can kind of give a little bit more of an overview of the presidential determination and then how that plays out locally. And then hopefully when her internet comes back, she can bring it back to the national level. So let me just pull up my numbers so I don't give you the wrong numbers. So every year, the Population, Refugees and Migration, PRM, posts a reception and placement notice of funding opportunity that the national agencies have to respond to. And so we have consultations with the resettlement agencies. Oops, are you?
That's all right, go ahead.
Okay. We have consultations with the resettlement agencies to determine, of that presidential determination, what numbers can we propose in these abstracts to resettle here in Colorado. The presidential determination, as Mark mentioned, is the cap. It's the maximum amount of folks that can come in to the United States. Do you want to talk nationally, Krish, before I jump into Colorado numbers, or should I jump into some Colorado implications and then go back up to nationally?
That sounds great in terms of the latter.
Okay. All right, let me pull them up again. So right now, what we're hearing for federal fiscal 22, which begins October 1st, is the presidential determination may be set at 125,000 folks. This is largely symbolic of this administration's commitment to the resettlement program, as it's going to take a while to rebuild all of the systems and processes overseas and here to get to 125,000. So what we're being told is to operate off of 65,000 refugees and then 10,000 SIVs coming over from the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Sorry, that's my doorbell. Very convenient. I have roofers, so I'm assuming that means they're done, and they will hopefully go on their way. Historically, Colorado resettles 2 to 3% of the national total. So going off of that 65,000 number for fiscal 22, we're estimating that there'll be about 2,000 refugees and 300 SIVs here in Colorado. We have resettlement agencies, as the team alluded to, we have resettlement agencies here in Metro Denver, and then we also have Lutheran Family Services down in the Springs and then in Greeley. So roughly 7% of the folks that arrive here go to Colorado Springs, about 8% in Greeley, and then the remainder in Metro Denver. And then I think that it's important to provide a little bit of context. So as Mark said, we are at the lowest number of arrivals ever. COVID kind of put a halt to arrivals for 6 solid months, I would say. But it's important to remember that both nationally and locally, we have done this in the past. So in 2016, nationally, we resettled just shy of 85,000 refugees. For Colorado, that was 1,956. And then between 2013 and 2015, we resettled nationally 70,000.
And Noise, if I can interrupt you there, and thank you for that context, I'd actually like to turn it over to Krish now to ask just a little bit about, given kind of some of this expand and then contracting, Krish, can you talk a little bit about what you and the other national agencies are doing to prepare and plan for what we hope to be increased arrivals?
Yeah, thank you so much, team, and Noise. Thank you for elaborating on kind of the local and regional context, and certainly happy to give you more of a national bird's eye view. So really, so delighted to be a part of this conversation. Such an important conversation to be having, especially right now. So as many of you know, and as was just described, the presidential determination is really essential to the functioning of the U.S. refugee resettlement program. For those of you who may not be as familiar, the presidential determination, or PD, it's essentially the formal declaration of the annual refugee admissions goal or ceiling for the coming fiscal year. It's signed each year before October 1st after consultation with Congress. But really, this is something that the president essentially unilaterally decides. Since the establishment of the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program in 1980, the PD has vacillated greatly, beginning with a historic high of nearly 240,000 under President Reagan, and then plunging to the historic low of 15,000 set by President Trump. In the interim, the numbers have varied, but largely remained, if you take the historical average prior to the Trump administration, the historical average was 95,000. So on the campaign trail, President Biden vowed to raise the ceiling to 125,000. After his inauguration, however, he signed an executive order that was intended to speed up refugee admissions to the US, particularly from countries that had been disproportionately excluded. But initially, he didn't raise the PD as promised. There was an outcry from the refugee resettlement agencies, local nonprofits, politicians from both sides of the aisle. I mean, it really was a coalition of voices. And the Biden administration has since announced a PD of 62,500, as was just mentioned. Our aim is to ensure that we get to 125,000 for fiscal year 2022, so basically next fiscal year. Historically, the capacity to raise refugee admissions has sat largely in the executive branch, as I mentioned, in consultation with Congress. But new proposed legislation aims to change that. So the Guaranteed Refugee Admission Ceiling Enhancement Act, or GRACE Act, would protect and restore the U.S. refugee program by setting a minimum refugee admissions goal of 120,000 and increasing congressional oversight over the administration's operations of the resettlement program. In other words, let's avoid having refugee resettlement become such a politicized issue that it can essentially feel like this kind of roller coaster ride. So LRS's advocacy team is hard at work trying to ensure this legislation is passed, not simply to cement the United States humanitarian leadership on refugee resettlement, but really to stabilize the resettlement system. And it's important to note, however, that the PD is not a mandate, but a goal. So due to the pandemic and other complications, the US will not resettle 62,500 refugees by the end of this fiscal year. Noise had obviously mentioned some of the numbers in terms of where we are right now. We're not anywhere close to getting to that. But the Department of State has decided to establish, as is noted, kind of operational goals. In other words, realistic targets in light of where we are right now. So those targets are 20,000 refugees and 12,000 SIVs. Currently, the total arrivals are 3,998 refugees and 2,493 SIV holders for a total of 6,491. So just less than 6,500 arrivals as of June 14th. So all this is to say that, as you all know, the resettlement system is at present incredibly vulnerable to change. We all know how damaging the last 4 years were to our resettlement system, not just our offices and infrastructure, but to our agencies and our employees and the communities that stood ready to welcome. And then, of course, most importantly, to the people that we all serve. but we're rebuilding. It will take a lot of work to prepare and plan for an almost 750% increase in arrival. It's a massive challenge, but where there's a will, there's a way, right, as we say, to rebuild. So on the domestic side of things, we're already starting to lay the groundwork on a few key areas that will be vital to welcoming more refugees. So we're currently working on obtaining the necessary certifications to activate or reactivate local sites to participate in the program again. We need to keep working diligently at rehiring employees who we were unable to keep on staff due to the severe cuts of the Trump administration. In some cases, these staff members represent experts with decades of experience and institutional knowledge. So it's a challenging undertaking. So many of these qualified case managers haven't had the luxury to wait around for resettlement. They've been forced to pursue other professional opportunities in the meantime. And it also means we need to revive dormant relationships with the communities who typically welcome refugees in the past. It's a major undertaking to reactivate relationships with landlords who are willing to rent out affordable accommodation to newly arrived refugee families. It's a competitive job market, as I think so many of us know. So it's no small feat to identify and collaborate with employers willing to take a chance on hiring refugees. But that said, the employers who do hire refugees cannot sing their praises enough. They tell us time and time again how refugees are some of the most dedicated, hardest working employees that they have. It's going to take some time to recruit and train volunteers to help furnish apartments, drive families to medical appointments or jobs, job interviews, and serve as friends in the months and years to come. We have the opportunity to create a system that is stronger than ever, one that is not so vulnerable to the whims of the White House or popular opinion, one that lives up to the highest humanitarian ideals. And so let me just end by saying, I believe that it's not only possible, but necessary. And now really is the time to think big. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krish. And I know you'll be leaving us a little bit early, so thank you in advance for your time today. And I think just based on, kind of that national understanding of what the national resettlement agencies are doing, Noise, I'd like to touch on your kind of role in how state agencies interact with both the National Resettlement Agency, as well as now hopefully coming down to our local resettlement agencies such as ACC.
Sure. I was going to start with community consultations, and Ron, I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about those since you haven't had a chance, and then I can talk about the role of Colorado Refugee Services Program and how we interact with both federal partners and then local agencies here.
Sure, and thank you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say too, no, I think it's helpful maybe from that lens based on, I believe in 2019, cities and counties were, there was, some administrative mandates for a consultation process that looked a little bit more of were counties and cities going to allow refugees to be resettled? And so I think, Ron, to Noise's point, it would be nice to kind of hear, has that kind of consultation process changed, and what is kind of that receptivity now to having refugees be resettled in various cities and counties? Sure.
Well, Ateem, I think you're referring to the former administration's requirement that local government entities kind of sign off on the whole concept of refugee resettlement before resettlement could actually take place within their jurisdictions. And so, there was an effort to actually go to county boards and city councils and actually get something in writing from them that stated they were open to and approved refugee resettlement to take place within their communities. I think this was intended to reduce the number of communities where resettlement could actually take place. But what we found happening here is that we received some overwhelming support from local entities here in Colorado. And not from all, but for the most part, it was very reaffirming in that. But that was not new in terms of community consultation. From the very beginning, refugee resettlement was designed at the national level to be a public and private partnership. It had to involve community engagement for it to work. As many of you on this call probably know, local resettlement agencies like ACC and like the other two, IRC and LIRS, who are active in the state of Colorado, we receive funding for the actual reception and placement of refugee families on a per capita basis. So as refugees come, the funding is there to provide services. When the arrivals decreased and when they stop, the funding decreases and stops. So that has put local refugee resettlement agencies in an impossible situation to maintain capacity, keep staff, as Krish was talking about. There was a huge capacity drain over the past 4 years. And as you mentioned in your opening comments, Atim, resettlement agencies across the country were closing. The local affiliates were closing. Fortunately, in Colorado, all three of the local service providers maintained the capacity to keep the doors open. I think as a testament to not only the innovation of the local agencies to diversify funding resources and services provided, but also in no small part due to the foresight of our State Refugee Coordinator's office and their fiscal management that helped ensure that there was some funding for refugee resettlement agencies to continue to serve the families that had already been resettled here. And so we are fortunate in the state of Colorado that took place. But another reason that the local agencies were able to stay open was community support, the engagement of donors and volunteers in the process of resettling refugee families. Now there is, and I know we'll probably talk about this more later on in the discussion, but there's a huge opportunity for that to even increase. In fact, I think for us to be able to attain and reach the capacity to resettle the numbers being talked about, it's a necessity that the idea of community engagement, the idea of community support and sponsorship is something that I think must take place at the local level here in the state of Colorado. But yeah, the consultations have always taken place. The idea of public support and private support of the refugee resettlement program has always been a part of the design. So every year, as we look at how many refugees we will be resettling over the next fiscal year, we have a conversation with our state refugee coordinator, with NOIS. But we also have conversations with individuals from the school systems, from public safety, from local government. So across the board, we get input from from sectors of the community. As we know, it really involves the entire community when we resettle refugees.
And I would say that that community consultation that Ron is talking about in terms of helping to determine numbers, we also have quarterly community consultations as well. And that is hosted together, CRISP and the resettlement agencies. And then we talk about resettlement in the local context. So as I mentioned, we have resettlement agencies in Greeley, Colorado Springs, and Denver. So we have quarterly consultations in those communities. If that's something you're interested in, reach out to Meg. I'm sure she'll put her email in the chat. All are welcome to attend. So there we discuss resettlement in local context. We talk about arrival trends, things like top countries, family composition, arrival numbers, services provided, and then it's really an opportunity to listen to community feedback. Ron was also talking about, and a team, you can stop me if you don't want me to keep expanding, but Ron was also talking about the community involvement. And one of the things that we have here is what we call the Colorado Alliance for Refugee Empowerment and Success, CARES. And it's the public-private partnership that we collectively plan, fund, and implement integrated services to refugees. So this is interested community members, ECBOs, faith communities, it's resettlement agencies, it's folks like Spring Institute, English as a second language providers. And then we also, as our role as the coordinating agency here in Colorado, we really help to set the vision of resettlement and integration, and then we implement that through a very exciting process of procurement and contracting. Ateem, do you want me to go into some of what CRISP funds and some of the funding roles and that sort of thing, or?
Let's pause there for a moment. I wanted just to come back to Krish really quickly and ask a little bit about national agencies and kind of any sort of coordination that you all are thinking about or discussing that might enhance the resettlement process from that national level. And maybe Krish, if you could just add, how many of your colleagues or other, partner agencies on that national level there are.
Yeah, appreciate the question, because it is a really important time to think about how we're approaching this. We can't just simply revert back to the system that was in place, prior to the steep reductions and decline in refugee resettlement. We've got to recognize that, there are some things that we do really well, and there are some things that really need to see some market improvement in terms of how we serve refugees, not just for those initial 3 months, but really in the long term. And, some people describe that as refugee resettlement 2.0. I don't know what the appropriate title is, but there are ongoing discussions between the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies that work with the State Department. But candidly, this is not a conversation that can only happen at the national level. And that is why, working with our affiliates who are really our partner partner community-based organizations that have that expertise, the know-how, they know what it has been to be in the trenches. That's how we gain the knowledge to really redesign and revolutionize the refugee resettlement system. And so just to give you a couple kind of descriptions of what that looks like. I think certainly one piece of this is recognizing that there are some key challenges that we all face across the country. So there's certainly an active ongoing discussion that we've had, including we actually just had a 3-day conference of all of our refugee resettlement directors across the country. And one of the key issues was affordable housing. So I think we need to think about how we can recognize that, especially in light of the pandemic, there are going to be dramatic changes in how space is used. So how can the refugee resettlement organizations address that new reality and leverage the fact that, in city centers, there may be space that could be converted from commercial. That isn't going to be an overnight solution, but I think it is worth us being proactive rather than reactive and defensive. Likewise, when we talk about economic empowerment, I still remember that Friday when Governor Abbott in Texas decided that he was essentially going to veto refugee resettlement. And that weekend I was sitting there thinking, well, if there's a family that, really family reunification for that family involves moving to Texas, how can we provide an alternative to the federal funding that unfortunately a family would have to forgo? And it's not ideal, but if I can find an employer who would hire you know, someone in that family to be the breadwinner, well, that's not a bad substitute in light of the key considerations. And so for us, one of the things that we've been working on is a program we call New American Cities. And the idea is, let's work with the federal government, but let's grow and build robust public-private partnerships that involve foundations and companies and high net value donors, some of whom may be refugees themselves, to invest not just in refugees, but in the communities, working with, you know, state government officials, national companies that have national and local footprints. So that to us is where, you know, there's a really important national conversation that can happen horizontally, but it very much needs to happen vertically as well, so that we can integrate and benefit from all of the incredible thinking and working that is going into rebuilding.
Team, can I join in on this point or these related points? And it looks like, I believe the answer is yes, and possibly a team is frozen. So as people may have seen as our bios went up at the beginning, I had, in the Obama administration, I had been at the Administration for Children and Families. I worked very closely with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And at the federal level, the resettlement process really involves this partnership between Department of State and Health and Human Services around, after refugees are admitted, around the supports for services in initial months and sometimes years in the country. And what I'd emphasize for this part of the discussion, a part, as colleagues have talked about, is just the realities of how resettlement agencies were impacted over this last number of years by the reductions in funding and what that's meant for staffing and closing of offices and loss of experience and all the rebuilding around that. The two other things that I'd urge bringing to the conversation, one of them is, before the last 4 years, this really was a bipartisan effort. And well, work needs to be done to rebuild the bipartisanship. What was striking when Ron talked about President Trump's executive order, it was structured to say that rather than just consultation, there had to be affirmative approval by states and localities. And I think many people thought that was going to lead to a number of states saying no. What was striking was, for the time it was in place until the court stopped it from going forward, Governor Abbott in Texas was actually the only governor who said no. And you know, some others hadn't made up their minds yet, but what was striking was how that process led really across the country to both states and communities saying they wanted to be supportive of refugee resettlement, but those are really conversations that need to happen at the state, local level to build support. And the crucial role, I think, of engaging people locally through consultation and other efforts is the direct experience that comes from working with refugee families and arriving refugees, and how that affects how people think about things in ways that often cuts through some of the politics of this. And then just the last point that I'd highlight, and I would say this has been particularly true at the HHS side, is that sometimes the program has been pretty narrowly focused on trying to get refugee adults into jobs as quickly as possible. And there is, in many areas, this broader recognition that integration must mean more than that, both in terms of economic success and supports and services and success for the whole family.
And Mark, I was going to just jump in and say that during that consent process, Jennifer Wilson, the executive director from the International Rescue Committee here in Colorado, spearheaded that immense effort. But I did want to say that any community that she approached to get consent, there were no no's. She got consent from everybody.
Thank you all. My apologies. My internet just totally decided to go kaput. So I'm back. And I actually wanted to turn our kind of conversation a little bit in talking about family reunification and really just talking about the refugees, the humans that we are serving through these different systems and processes. And so as we kind of think about, you know, we know that bringing families together that have been separated by conflicts is extremely important for integration in the new cities that they're going to be living in. Ron, could you maybe talk a little bit about how you have seen the consequences of the bans, the travel bans, the Muslim ban, you know, how have you seen that play out with our local communities?
Sure. Well, I think that policies like the travel bans that were put into place and, you know, that we believed were discriminatory and even racist. We saw the effect that had not only on the families who were ready to travel, who were approved, had gone through vetting processes, and were ready to start a new life here in the U.S. How their lives were disrupted, how the plans were just abruptly stopped, and now how they continue to be in a process of getting back to that point, many of who had to start all over, and are still going through that process today. So families who, if we, you know, just thinking about the very definition of refugee, those who are facing persecution, they were this close to resettling in the U.S. and being free from that trauma and of persecution, and then that was just ripped away from them. Families who were here, who were waiting for families to maybe parts of their families to be reunited with them. It had a traumatic effect on families living in our own community. But, you know, I think we also can't, we can't forget the fact that even individuals who were here, who maybe had already resettled here, who were Muslim, just the fact that took place, that these policies were enacted, it had a demoralizing impact on the lives of individuals and families, and it had a demoralizing impact on the entire system, on service providers as well. And so I still see that we're, you know, there has been some hope injected into the system, and we see hope on the horizon. We see better days on the horizon, but the process that still families are going through to get back to that point where they were able to come to the U.S. and you know, for some it has been a process of years, and for many it will be a process of additional months and years to actually even finally get here, because those policies were in place. So it truly did have an impact from the network and the systems that were in place, but an incredible impact on individuals' lives and families' lives. That continues to be felt today.
Yeah. And Mark, I wanted to maybe come back to you to talk a little bit about the SIV concerns that you touched on in your remarks. given that the U.S. is set to leave Afghanistan. How do you have any kind of thoughts on, what that family reunification might look like, or the challenges that might be felt by SIVs that are either here and, as Ron talked about, waiting for family members, or that are back in Afghanistan waiting for processing?
Sure. So for the SIV program, and as we talked about some at the beginning, I mean, these are principally for people who have helped in the U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, are now in danger as a result of helping what they've done in helping the U.S. and are seeking to get out. So the program has had a lot of difficulties in recent years, and it has been extremely slow, significant backlogs, and this is always a problem when it happens, but it's a particular problem in circumstances where people are fearful that they're going to be killed, or their family members are going to be killed at any point for what they did to help the United States. So, so there are many backlogs that need to be addressed, but this one is, I think, extremely urgent. So that's the overall context, and what was encouraging there was very early on in the administration, through an executive order, that President Biden recognized the need to strengthen and improve the SIV program, and to address a lot of the administrative issues and identify ways in which it should be expanded. So that was sort of already in place. And then what's happened over these last several months has been, with the president's announcement about leaving Afghanistan, this creates much greater urgency for those who help the U.S. war effort. And it is, it's not a situation where they can sort of wait until the day after we leave. They, in many instances, wish to get out as quickly as possible. So what I would say is, there is a lot of awareness of this. I don't know the specifics of where administration planning is. If for anybody who's just following this in the press, you are probably seeing increased media coverage of it, including raising the possibilities of, because this is a process that involves security and vetting, and all of that takes time. Could there be ways of getting people to safe third countries while still awaiting the process of getting approved for admission to the United States? But I think this will be, both for the administration and for Congress, I think this is going to be a very significant focus in the coming months, and hopefully, I would say, even weeks.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, Noise, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Ron, correct me if my numbers are wrong. One positive development was the change from an allocation of 10,000 SIVs to 12,000 for this year.
That is positive, and we'll take it. So just in terms of, those refugees, we've talked a little bit about the refugees that are living here and have been resettled and are hoping to either reunite with family members that were, kind of stuck in the process, or the process stopped before they could come. Ron, can you talk a little bit about kind of how your agency and resettlement agencies kind of go through the process of identifying family members that have family here in the U.S. versus bringing individuals who don't have family, and kind of what are some of the considerations that you take into account?
Absolutely. Well, every year, as part of the numbers that the local resettlement agency will receive, some of those do have support systems already here, family members already here, or what we term as U.S. ties. Others are free cases that are basically resettled in a community without the U.S. tie. And of course, it does take more concentrated resources for free cases. Whereas with a family with U.S. tie, with family members already here, we see that those family members pitch in and are able to help fill in some of the blank spots that are required to be filled to fully resettle and help the family, empower them to move along that road toward integration and self-sufficiency. So as we look at our community every year, we assess housing availability, we assess employment projections, we assess schools and transportation systems, and we assess our capacity to recruit and engage volunteers. We assess our capacity to raise additional funds that are required to resettle families as they arrive. And all of this is taken into consideration as we determine a reasonable number to resettle. But I want to make a point here too, that as we're looking at building capacity to resettle larger numbers, I think some may say, well, why don't you just build that capacity first before you resettle those larger numbers? And I want to go back to the point where the way the system is funded, the way local resettlement agencies are funded, it requires the arrivals before resources are received. Now this year they are implementing some flexibility in the way, to help ensure that local resettlement agencies can help maintain capacity and when arrival numbers are low, but there's still that element of we receive funding to build that capacity once those arrivals are here. So we can't wait to build capacity first. It has to be happening concurrently. And that's why it's so important, I think, for this community engagement piece to be, that we focus on it and really build that capacity as well, because it will require additional community engagement, additional community support as we resettle larger numbers and build capacity at the same time.
And this is for, oh, go on, Noise.
I'm taking the liberty of chiming in. As Ron mentioned, the reception and placement funding is on a per capita structure. Our funding that we channel to the resettlement agencies is not. And so I think it's always important to remember that while reception and placement is supposed to fund the first 90 days of a refugee's arrival, our funding really kicks in for the full eligibility period. We are able to serve refugees up to 5 years from their date of arrival. And one of the commitments that we made as best we could over the last 4 years and continuing on is to really try to support the infrastructure that we had here in Colorado. So we were fortunate enough not to have to close any resettlement agencies. And that's one of the things that we're looking at with the resettlement agencies is really how do we start to build capacity, recognizing that part of their funding structure not coming through our office is on a per capita basis. But those are conversations that have been happening for months, and all of the fund contracting things that come with that. But those are conversations that we're having as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I was just going to ask if anyone had any comments about this a different model that Ron is talking about, you know, co-sponsorship or community sponsorship. Ron, can you maybe talk a little bit about what that might look like, you know, as Noy's, you know, reference building capacity and maybe a different way, and we've all been talking about kind of innovative change that might be needed, rethinking, reimagining how we do resettlement.
Yes. Well, the idea, the model of community sponsorship and co-sponsorship isn't really new. It's been around for a long time, and in other countries it's practiced very effectively. But I think for us it has been something that we need to focus on building capacity for local resettlement agencies to engage the community, to recruit community co-sponsors, and to effectively train them. Because when what we do, and of course there's a range of involvement, you know, where some groups, whether it's a faith group or a civic group or a business employee group, or even just a group of friends, where they would agree to take on certain aspects, certain responsibilities and tasks involved in resettling a refugee family. For some, it may just be raising enough funds to pay for rent for the 3-month resettlement period. For others, it's much more involved. They will meet families at the airport when they first arrive. They'll secure an apartment. They'll furnish that apartment. They'll set it up. They'll provide transportation, make sure kids are enrolled in schools, and parents in ESL and other trainings. So they actually, you know, the resettlement tasks are actually delegated entirely to those groups. So there's a range of involvement, a range of opportunities for different groups to be involved. But again, I think this is going to be key to our ability. I say our, I'm talking about Colorado and the other resettlement agencies too. It's going to be key to our ability to resettle increased numbers while we're trying to build capacity.
And a team, can I come in on this one? Yep. So as Ron indicates, the concept has been around for a long time. It sometimes has different meanings and different definitions in different settings. But there has been, I would say, a big increase in active conversations about how to bring community or co-sponsorship into the refugee program in the last several years. And part of that has been because of what happened to funding, and because of the hopes that this could lead to greater refugee admissions. I think another important part of it is around trying to bring a more comprehensive approach to integration and to the supports that can be provided to arriving families, and ways in which engagement of voluntary groups and neighbors and faith-based groups and the business community and others can all help lead to better outcomes. There is, in some ways, I at least think it's helpful to think of this kind of along a continuum, where, you know, at one end there can be pretty limited volunteering. At the other end, you know, it's potentially taking a very large role in the process of helping refugees resettle. I do think there are questions to get worked out about what's best done by state government, what's best done by resettlement agencies, and what can be best done by community groups and neighborhood groups and volunteers. And sometimes it's just more efficient to have part of the process done by somebody rather than somebody else. And other times it can be about making better, more comprehensive supports. But I would say, I mean, both in Colorado and really around the country, that's a big part of the conversation to have now.
And Mark, I think to that point about better systems or supports for the whole family, can you talk a little briefly about the Human Services Initiative that you're working on, or at least that you're a part of at MPI?
Sure, happy to. So I should say Migration Policy Institute does research and policy work around a very broad range of immigration issues in the US and around the world. And then our Human Services Initiative focuses on immigration issues affecting families and children and humanitarian populations and links between immigration and health and human services programs. So we do a bunch of work in a range of areas. And as you can probably tell in my comments around refugee resettlement, one of the areas that we've particularly focused on is strengthening attention to the needs of young children, of youth transitioning to adulthood, to efforts to seek to promote better jobs for refugee families, and then the set of new challenges around the pandemic response, and the increased attention to racial equity issues, and how those intersect with refugee resettlement. And I do think that in this area, and the federal outcomes that get measured for the program, tend to be ones around rapid employment and new jobs last 90 days. And, and I think that taking a whole family approach underscores sort of how many other aspects of successful arrival and integration make, are things to incorporate in what happens. And again, this very much involves partnerships of government and resettlement agencies and community.
Thank you for that. As we kind of are winding down our time, I would be remiss if I did not ask if someone wanted to talk about some of the other humanitarian immigrant groups that are supported by resettlement agencies. And I'm wondering, Ron or Noise or even Mark, if you wanted to kind of talk about some of those humanitarian groups, such as asylees, unaccompanied refugee minors, and kind of how they all blend into this revitalized or rebuilding of the refugee resettlement program.
Well, I do know that that we will see, an increase in the numbers that we serve. That would include refugees and unaccompanied minors, as well as the asylees, as you mentioned. And they come with, when we resettle them or when we assist them, we do it with oftentimes fewer resources, but it's critical, we believe, to continue to provide those services, because the needs faced by those individuals are the same. And what we see as in building our capacity to receive increased arrivals, we also see the need to increase our capacity to serve and these other groups as well. I do think that that refugee resettlement agencies are very well positioned in order to provide those services, but we've lost capacity to do that over the past few years. And so I think we're looking at our ability to serve asylees, to serve unaccompanied minors and these other groups that you mentioned. When we talk about building capacity, we're also looking at building capacity to serve these groups as well.
And I'll chime in. Not all states have an unaccompanied refugee minor program, a URM program. Colorado does. And similar to the adult refugees, the URM program, we saw a drastic decrease in arrivals over the last 4 years, particularly this year. And so we are also planning on an expansion there and returning back to levels like we were at in 2016.
And just add a little bit, this spring, there's of course been a lot in the news about unaccompanied children arriving at the border and the increased numbers of those children this spring. Many of those children are fleeing from violence particularly in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. They will be seeking asylum when they get here. It takes a while for the asylum processing to go forward. Once children get here, they initially are in federal custody. They then get released to parents and other sponsors. When they get released, they're in the community, they're awaiting their immigration proceedings, and at least from the federal government, there is often very little by way of services and supports. And so we actually did a report last week highlighting the need to strengthen community supports for unaccompanied children. They'll connect in what Noise was talking about, that the unaccompanied refugee minor program is partially for children who arrive as refugees, but without family, without parents, and also is used for unaccompanied children who do attain one of a set of immigration statuses and don't have a parent or sponsor to go to. So that program plays a key role in helping those children. And then, there are frankly some big gaps for situations when children are released to their parents or other sponsors.
Yeah, lots to tackle. Before we go to question and answer, I really wanted to just throw out the question, from all of the various challenges, observations, concerns, desires that we've heard and talked about today, are there any main opportunities or big opportunities that you want our audience to really walk away with in terms of the resettlement process and what it's going to take for rebuilding?
I would.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, no, my appeal will just be brief. As people who are hearing this and sharing this with others, perhaps, to consider within your own spheres of influence, within your own social groups, consider opportunities to be engaged in more ways than you have in the past. I think that there's going to be a lot more opportunities for groups to be involved, a lot more opportunity for community engagement in the actual process of resettlement. And so we believe that the community will respond. And so I would just appeal to those of you on this call and to truly consider that within groups that you are already a part of.
All right, well, Ron was far more eloquent than I was going to be, so I'm glad you went first, Ron. I will also just say to steal Colorado Refugee Connect's language, now is really a great opportunity to learn, engage, and celebrate.
The one thing that I would add is, sometimes we have discussions of problems that seem insoluble and enormously difficult. And this situation is instead one where there is a challenge before us, but it is also just a wonderful opportunity. I mean, the challenge is there have been few refugee arrivals in recent years, and now we think there are going to be many more. That does present a set of challenges, but it's a wonderful set of challenges to be taking on. And I think for those involved in refugee resettlement, they welcome the challenge and welcome those who have not been involved or not been involved recently in joining in.
Good old mute button. I think we're going to open it up for a few questions now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And while we're waiting, I really do want to just thank all of our presenters and again, all of those who are behind the scenes taking questions and entering in information. And honestly, for all of you who are here and have stayed on with us, I recognize it is a Friday and you could be doing other things, but I do hope that, this time with us today has been not only informative, but also, inspiring to engage. I think the time that you've chosen today, as we know, World Refugee Day is on Sunday. It hopefully demonstrates your care and concern for the millions, as Mark mentioned, of refugees who flee their homes, in search of peace. And so we I think, have really discussed in wide areas and ranges of supports and needs for our refugee communities throughout Colorado, but here in Denver as well. Looks like we have one question. So let me go with Anna. As a community, what would you all consider to be the most important first step community members could take in supporting the rebuilding of the refugee resettlement program? Step 1.
Colorado Refugee Connect, I think would be a great first step.
And any other first steps? Anyone else has a different first step? Because they're all steps. All right, let's go to Noise.
Resettlement agencies to volunteer to learn more.
And a shout out from Kit to Noise or Mark. What makes Colorado the nation's best refugee resettlement program?
Of course, Kit would ask this. I'd be interested in Mark's take on this, but I would say that I always used to joke, Kit was the former state refugee coordinator. I always used to joke that Kit was 12 steps ahead and I'm 8 steps ahead, maybe 4 steps ahead. But I think that we really are very innovative here in Colorado. We really do try to make data-informed decisions, get refugee voice, and we've really impacted programs. So like a great example of this is recognizing the need to revamp our English as a second language program and couple English classes with on-site childcare. for example. But in one word, I would say that we are extremely innovative.
Well, and while while I don't actually rank state programs, I will say I agree with everything Noyes just said about how thoughtful and innovative the Colorado program is. Not long after I left the federal government and came to MPI, I did a site visit to Colorado, and heard then, and have stayed in touch over the years, heard then about the number of thoughtful, innovative initiatives that the state was doing and supporting, and the important to us, the use of data, the use of research, the use of listening to people in the community, and having that inform how the program moves forward. And it is just always fun to hear what is Colorado doing next.
I would agree. I think as both Noyes and Mark indicated, innovation is driving that that highest ranking, in my opinion. But being relatively new to Colorado and to the system here, I also see the willingness to work together, to cooperate, to collaborate is also key to making it the best. I've seen it over and over again, and have really been impressed from day one how the different entities work together, share resources. And as we think of tackling some of the key challenges to refugee resettlement and to rebuilding the system, such as housing, I think it's going to take innovation, it's going to take collaboration. And so if anyone out there on this call has ideas to increase options, affordable housing options for refugees, please, we would love to talk to you about that. If you know of landlords who don't currently rent or are not participating and active in the system, we would love to have conversations with them and let them know what kind of support we provide those families when we place them in their apartment. So it's just the working together that I see happening as well.
Thanks, Ron. There's two questions. The first question is about increased funding, federal funding, to help rebuild the resettlement and integration infrastructure that was gutted due to the prior administration's policy decisions. Do any of you have any insight? Obviously, I think we all are hopeful, but any other kind of understandings from the national level?
I would say that we are hopeful. The president's budget was released. So the president doesn't pass the budget, Congress does, but what we saw is about double the request as 2016 levels, which is extremely encouraging. So we wait to see what happens, but that's at least a great encouragement for us.
And then, go on, Mark.
Okay, well, so I agree with that. I mean, and as we talked about a little bit, I mean, there are really two parts of this. There's what happens for the State Department, and what happens for Health and Human Services. And Ron was noting before, one of the really important changes that the State Department has made is it had been the case that funding only went out on a per capita basis. And what that meant, based upon the number of arrivals, and what that meant was that when the number of arrivals plummeted, the funding plummeted. And they've now moved this year to separating out a part of it being per capita and a part of it being administrative funding that can hopefully provide for stabilization and growth. And then on the HHS side, the administration is seeking significant new funding. It actually gets complicated, unfortunately, because the refugee program and funding for unaccompanied children are in the same budget account. And what that means is sometimes when unaccompanied children costs go way up, it puts pressure on refugee funding. They will be seeking significant new funding for both. And, you know, but how that plays out in Congress, I mean, on the one hand, you know, Democrats have majorities, but for appropriations bills, people are going to have to work together. So, you know, so I think it's unclear exactly how that's all going to play out, but as the first step in the process, they are seeking significant additional funding.
Well, this has been a very, very informative, but also just, I think, really engaging conversation just around the different levels of refugee resettlement and what it's going to take to hopefully rebuild, as I refer to, an engine that has gone a bit dormant, and all of the innovations and you know, I would say collaborative supports that are going to be needed. I look forward to, you know, as a city representative, I look forward to, you know, that community consultation, and really trying to work on integration holistically, not only in Denver, but also, you know, in Colorado and nationally, because the work we do here hopefully can, you know, ripple into other places, and the work that we find in other places can be brought here. So I again want to thank everyone for joining us today. A few announcements. There's in the chat, there was a link to a webinar next week that's going to be focusing on Colorado's refugee and immigrant focused legislative accomplishments. There were several that happened this year. There were several that did not happen or pass that are also noteworthy. So that should be a very interesting panel, and that's going to be hosted by a panel of special immigrant visa holders as well, to discuss in more detail that the Afghan SIV program. And then I would just leave us with, you know, my role as the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is to really serve as a resource for immigrant and refugee community members and connecting residents to city resources, education, and information. We want to continue dialogues like this and partnerships like this. So please, you know, reach out if you'd like to be on our community outreach list, and check out our website for you know, updates on information, policy related information. So again, thank you all. Have a great Friday and weekend. Happy World Refugee Day, Immigrant Heritage Month, Juneteenth. Again, thank you all to our presenters, and have a good day. Bye-bye.